Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a text that's probably going to flip everything you thought you knew about Jean-Jacques Rousseau completely upside down. It uses a really unconventional format, a spiritual interview, to reinterpret the famous Enlightenment thinker, and in doing so, it offers a radical new lens on modern education, genius, and politics. Whether you're a philosophy buff or just curious about how historical ideas shape the world we live in today, this text forces us to look at concepts we thought we had figured out centuries ago in a completely different light.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll look at the true intentions, according to Rousseau's spirit, unpack the misunderstanding around Yutori Education, explore school education versus the birth of genius, dig into the real meaning of the general will, and finally, touch on the role of religion in preventing tyranny.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the true intentions, according to Rousseau's spirit.
The source text we're looking at is titled Spirituality and Education. And what's really fascinating here is the framing. It presents itself as a channeled dialogue with the spirit of Rousseau himself. Now, without getting bogged down in the spiritual mechanics of how that works, we're simply going to explore the arguments it presents. It uses this deeply unique framework to challenge some seriously entrenched societal norms.
To really appreciate the pivot this book makes, we kind of have to ground ourselves in Rousseau's historical legacy first. You know him, right? He's a titan of Enlightenment thinking, the author of the groundbreaking educational treatise Emile, and a massive champion of human equality. Setting that stage makes the shift we're about to discuss, how his ideas have allegedly been totally distorted in modern times, that much more dramatic.
Moving right along to Section 2, the misunderstanding of Yutori Education.
The book points out this massive societal misunderstanding of Rousseau's famous phrase, return to nature. You see this a lot when people try to justify relaxed schooling policies, like Japan's Yutori Education. Modern systems often interpret return to nature as literally just leaving kids alone in a primitive state to do whatever they want without any rigorous study. But the text argues this was never about lazy abandonment. Nature actually refers to a child's pure, uncorrupted state. And true education, it's about actively polishing that innate brilliance.
So according to this channeled text, proper education is actually an active, highly involved refining process. It is literally the exact opposite of passive neglect disguised as freedom. It's about stripping away all that societal corruption to reveal this incredible inner potential and then working really hard to make it shine.
Which brings us to Section 3, School Education and the Birth of Genius.
Now, the book absolutely acknowledges the social merits of free public schooling. Especially during financial crises, it can be a great political decision, helping talented youth, maybe those in literature or art who would otherwise need wealthy patrons just to survive. But the text issues a pretty stark warning here. State-run systems are fundamentally engineered from the top down for standardization. They're just not built to nurture exceptional mold-breaking outliers. The text willingly concedes that modern public schooling is actually highly successful at what it was built to do, mass-producing capable average citizens. It successfully raises the baseline of a nation's literacy and basic competence. But the trade-off? You're trading individual brilliance for collective uniformity.
And because of that exact uniformity, the source delivers a truly surprising claim. It argues that if Rousseau were alive today, our modern school system might completely reject him. He'd probably be labeled a dropout, a failure, or maybe even a hikikomore, a social shut-in. The argument is that true genius almost always has to forge a path entirely outside of state control, because standardizing everything is the ultimate enemy of revolutionary thought.
Let's dive into Section 4, the true meaning of the general will. Okay, this definition completely flips traditional political science on its head. In most textbooks, the general will is taught as the ultimate secular authority of the citizens, period. But the book argues Rousseau never actually meant it to be an absolute. Instead, it was supposed to be a temporary placeholder. Think of it as a backup plan for human consensus in an age where direct divine revelation or prophetic guidance just couldn't be confirmed.
The text strongly emphasizes that it's a grave historical mistake to use the general will to justify atheism or to push this idea that the majority is always right. When you contrast our modern, purely secular interpretation with the book's deeply spiritual framework, you see that the general will is inherently flawed. It desperately needs moral and spiritual checks and balances simply because human consensus on its own can be incredibly dangerous.
And this philosophical misunderstanding is not just some dry academic debate, it's genuinely dangerous. Elevating human consensus to the level of absolute truth has historically allowed angry mobs to run completely out of control. The text actually points to the massive bloodshed of the French Revolution as a prime example of what happens when the general will is stripped of its spiritual context and morphs into violent tyranny.
This perfectly sets up Section 5, the role of religion in preventing tyranny. This brings us to the source's ultimate conclusion. When mob rule or a runaway democratic majority threatens to destroy society, or when it starts infringing on deeper moral truths, religious leaders have a very specific duty. According to the text, they must step outside the popular consensus and act as the essential and often highly unpopular voice of warning.
The book argues that human arrogance, this idea that our collective vote somehow magically creates absolute moral truth, has to be tempered by a higher perspective. It warns that unchecked democratic power can so easily transform into a dictatorship of the majority, where society completely loses sight of what is actually good or just.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. The source really forces us to hold up a mirror to our own society. Think about our modern era, where absolute public consensus and social media outrage often dictate what's considered true. If the general will runs out of control today, who is actually brave enough to stand up and issue that necessary warning? It's a heavy question, and it absolutely makes us rethink Rousseau, our approach to education, and the very foundation of our democracy.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a truly fascinating source text that's basically going to completely reevaluate the legacy of one of history's absolute heavyweights, Immanuel Kant. We're looking at a text that bridges high-level, abstract philosophy with something surprisingly grounded and practical: how we raise our kids. Let's get right into it. But right off the bat, we have to tackle a massive historical assumption. Was Immanuel Kant really the father of modern atheism? I mean, if you've ever taken a standard philosophy class, you were probably taught that Kant championed a purely secular worldview, essentially locking religion entirely out of the academic sphere. But what if that mainstream academic consensus is actually completely backwards? That right there is the central mystery of our explainer today. To unpack this, we're turning to our source material for today, a really intriguing book titled Spirituality and Education. Now, just a heads up, this isn't your standard historical biography. The text presents what it calls a spiritual message from Kant himself. It offers this radically different first-hand perspective on his life's work, his true beliefs, and, surprisingly, some pretty bold advice from modern society. Regardless of your personal take on spiritual messages, the arguments laid out here provide a completely unique lens for looking at Kant's philosophy. So, here's our agenda for today, bridging that gap between philosophy and child-rearing. Number 1, the misunderstood philosopher. 2, faith, reason, and asceticism. 3, rebutting materialistic myths. 4, early childhood and morality. And 5, the genius education model.
All right, Section 1, the misunderstood philosopher. We're going to reevaluate Kant's legacy and explore this massive gap between what Kant supposedly intended and how modern society currently interprets him.
So this really highlights the core contrast we're dealing with. On one hand, we have the materialist myth. That's the widely held assumption that Kant's work proved humans just invented God, pushing us toward pure secularism. But the source reality presented in our text, it claims Kant actually possessed a profound, explicit belief in the spiritual realm and a very deep, personal interest in religion. He wasn't out to destroy faith at all. He was, apparently, a deeply spiritual man. Moving on to Section 2, faith, reason, and asceticism. Why did he separate them? I mean, this leads us to a pretty glaring contradiction, right? If Kant was so deeply spiritual, why did he famously draw such a hard, definitive line separating religion from academia? Well, the text gives us a crucial answer, and it comes down to the concept of asceticism. It explains that Kant separated the two not because he didn't believe, but as an incredibly strict, almost monastic discipline. Kant was a bachelor, a self-described bookworm who barely ever left his hometown of Königsberg. He knew that if he allowed himself to fully indulge his intense fascination with spiritual and religious phenomena, it would literally consume all of his time. So he deliberately drew that line to ensure he could actually finish his monumental academic work. It was all about hyperfocus. Looking directly at Chapter 2 of the text, we uncover another really vital layer here, the historical context. This separation wasn't just about his personal focus. It was a straight-up survival tactic for academic freedom. By distancing his work from religion, he was actively shielding his philosophy from the dogmatic, dangerous, medieval religious practices of the time, and the lingering, very real shadow of witch trials. He essentially needed to carve out a safe, secular space to think freely, completely safe from persecution. Okay, section 3, rebutting materialistic myths. This is a historical lamentation because, as we'll see, that survival tactic totally backfired in the long run. The text presents a highly emotional rebuttal from Kant regarding how his philosophy was twisted after his death. It notes that later generations claimed, and this is a pretty shocking quote here, Kant's philosophy's essence chopped off God's head on the guillotine just as the French Revolution chopped off the king's head. Wow. Kant passionately laments this specific misinterpretation in the text. He firmly denies the materialistic idea that his work was ever meant to quote-unquote kill God. He states clearly that anyone truly studying his work will see he explicitly recognized God and even admired spiritual thinkers of his era. Let's head into section 4, early childhood and morality, applying philosophy to parenting. We are pivoting from abstract ideas to some highly practical advice from the source. How does this reevaluated, spiritually aware version of Kant think we should actually be educating our kids? The text lays out a really clear chronological framework for early education. Step 1 is absolute. You have to instill the strict values of good and evil early on. You can't just let a kid figure out their own morals from scratch, right? You have to teach them right from wrong. But, and this is super important, step 2, you must build their immunity to the irrationalities of the real world. You can't just leave them in this bubble of pure, innocent moral perfection. And this builds to a fascinating, deeply psychological point. The text warns that if a child is raised to be too pure, too angelic, they simply won't have the immunity needed to survive the muddy waters, as the text puts it, of the real world. If you shield them completely, the shock of human irrationality and cruelty when they enter public school or wider society is just going to be way too much. They risk severe social maladaptation or even becoming completely withdrawn shut-ins. Basically, you have to expose them to a little bit of those muddy waters so they can build up a strong emotional immune system. That brings us to section 5, the genius education model, looking at lessons from history. How do we actually balance giving a child a rock-solid moral foundation without making them too fragile for reality? Well, the text anchors this concept historically by pointing to the Jewish model of education as a blueprint for cultivating what it calls a genius. It raises the question, why do such a disproportionate number of Nobel laureates and groundbreaking thinkers come from this specific background? The source points to a key practice: parents repeatedly reading the Old Testament to their children from an incredibly young age. We're talking early, rigorous exposure to the complex history of prophets, massive historical narratives, and really deep moral struggles. Engaging in these recitation practices with such complex ideas physically and mentally preps the child's brain. And here is the ultimate takeaway from today's explainer. According to the source, this early exposure isn't just about religious piety. Reading these profound historical and spiritual texts leaves high-level vibrations in the young brain. Even if a toddler doesn't understand every single word, the sheer complexity and the spiritual weight of the material stimulates their brain in unique ways. It acts like a seed. Later in life, when that child enters the academic or professional world, that foundation allows them to receive massive inspiration and unlock the highest levels of creative and intellectual genius. It's literally a mental workout, prepping them for greatness. Which really leaves us with a ton to think about regarding our modern, mostly secular education systems. By entirely removing spiritual and deep moral histories from early childhood, are we actually stunting our children's potential? Are we sacrificing the moral and spiritual foundations required to raise a true genius just to make sure everyone meets an average standardized test score? It's a hugely provocative question, and one that completely changes how we view both Kant's legacy and our own future. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep questioning the world around you.
Is modern schooling actually destroying true creativity? It's a pretty bold question, right? But think about it. What if the very system we've designed to elevate our minds is literally putting a ceiling on human potential? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a profound, highly debated philosophical critique of how we educate kids today.
We're looking at a fascinating text called Spirituality in Education, specifically zeroing in on Chapter 3, Now is the Time to Liberate Religious Education. This source presents a spiritual message attributed to the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner. And let me tell you, it offers a striking diagnosis of modern schools, proposing a totally radical rethink of how we nurture both the human intellect and the soul. I'm here to help break down the structure of these arguments so we can see exactly what's at stake here.
Okay, let's jump right in. Here's the roadmap.
First, the modern education crisis. 2, spirituality versus secular schooling. 3, escaping the vegetable factory. 4, dangers of state monopoly. And finally, 5, liberating educational choice.
Starting with Part 1, the modern education crisis. So, the text diagnoses a really specific problem with highly educated elites today. The argument is that modern education leans so heavily into pure rote knowledge that it creates this massive imbalance. Basically, the more some people study inside this rigid framework, the more pessimistic they actually become. The source points out that a lot of folks who totally ace the academic game end up losing their drive to challenge the status quo. Instead of using their big brains to lead and give back to society, they kind of turn inward and become entirely self-centered. They've mastered the test, sure, but the text argues they've completely lost their greater purpose. Just think about some of the highly educated leaders out there today. The text is basically asking us, did their rigorous schooling actually strip away their desire to genuinely serve others?
Moving on to Part 2, spirituality versus secular schooling.
Here, the text draws a massive contrast between two completely different worldviews. On one side, you have modern secular education. This is a system obsessed with quantifiable test scores, total conformity, and basically prepping students to be cogs in a corporate machine. On the flip side is the proposed alternative, spiritual education. The text asserts that true genius doesn't actually come from memorizing a textbook, it comes from divine inspiration. It's about tapping into the spiritual world. Plus, it argues that a spiritual perspective instills deep humility, which is absolutely crucial if you want genuine, compassionate leadership.
And the source makes this point incredibly starkly, stating outright, education without religion is the destruction of creativity. Now, whether you personally agree with that or not, it's super important to understand the logic. The argument is that when a school system completely denies the existence of a higher power or a spiritual realm, it effectively traps the human mind inside a tiny little box. It cuts students off from the true source of inspiration. Through this lens, a purely materialistic education is only ever going to produce standardized thinkers, no true paradigm-shifting creators.
Which brings us to Part 3, escaping the vegetable factory.
The source points out a pretty staggering statistic. It argues that it is perfectly normal for around 20% of children to just not adapt to the modern school system. You know, we so often treat kids who refuse to go to school as if they're somehow broken or failing, but the text completely flips that script. It argues that expecting 40 totally unique human beings to sit in a room and absorb the exact same curriculum at the exact same pace, that's what's actually unreasonable and unnatural.
The text uses this really vivid metaphor. Forcing absolute uniformity on kids is like trying to grow vegetables in a planned, artificial factory. But last time I checked, humans aren't greenhouse tomatoes. We're dynamic, we're complex. When you try to mass-produce education the same way you'd mass-produce factory farm lettuce, you inevitably crush the natural, wild potential of the individual.
The ultimate critique here is that the modern school system is basically acting as a processing plant. It's trying to mold every single child into compliant reserve troops for corporate life. You know, corporate workers who follow directions perfectly, but completely lack that individual spark. The text passionately argues that a healthy society shouldn't even want a uniform army of identical workers. What it actually needs is diverse, uniquely talented individuals.
Now, Part 4, dangers of state monopoly.
The source outlines what it sees as a highly dangerous domino effect. It goes like this. When the state holds a monopoly on education, it gets to dictate the worldview. And because modern states lean heavily secular, they end up imposing a strictly materialistic, atheistic view of the world on all children. The text warns that this monopoly essentially grants the government the freedom to brainwash its citizens right from a young age. At its absolute extreme, the source argues, this level of total state control over the minds of the youth bears a really dangerous resemblance to National Socialism.
I want to pause for just a second to let the gravity of that claim sink in. The text is making a profound argument for freedom of thought here. It suggests that when a single entity, like the government, has unchecked power to tell every single child what is true, what is false, what has value and what doesn't, it strips away foundational human liberties. It's a direct, unapologetic challenge to the idea that state-run education is somehow inherently neutral or benign.
Finally, Part 5, liberating educational choice.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that the text doesn't just point out all of these problems, it actually gives us a roadmap for change. Step 1 is breaking the state's monopoly on schooling. Step 2 is vastly expanding the types of schools available. We're talking free schools, specialized talent academies, environments specifically tailored to different types of minds. And step 3 is liberating religious and spiritual education. So schools that teach spiritual values can operate freely without being pushed to the margins by the state.
Ultimately, the goal presented by the text is crystal clear. We need to move away from state control, with its forced, uniform curriculums and strictly materialistic worldviews. Instead, we need to move toward true freedom of choice. The argument is that in a genuinely free educational market, diverse values can thrive. Good ideas will naturally flourish, and systems that just don't serve kids will fade away. By allowing spiritual values to integrate back into education, we give parents the actual power to choose an environment that nurtures their child's whole being, not just their ability to pass a standardized test.
We've covered a ton of profound ground today, exploring a deeply spiritual critique of how we learn and grow. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought derived directly from today's explainer. If the state designs the classroom, who designs the child's soul? It's a question that really challenges us to look beyond the daily curriculum and consider the true ultimate purpose of education. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.